Imagine being trapped in a cage, locked up and unable to see the world around you. You wouldn't be able to understand how big the cage is or what's outside. You wouldn't know that you're in a cage at all. That's what it's like to be confined, to be kept prisoner in a way that you're unaware of. This metaphor is something that has been described by several sources, each using slightly different terminology, but all referring to a similar concept that I'm going to call invisible confinement. And there's probably no better time to talk about this than right now. Given what's happening in Afghanistan and what people are going through in places like Gaza, I'll get into what they have in common in a moment. But first, let me describe some of the things these sources say about invisible confinement. For starters, it's an idea that relates to what Plato called the allegory of the cave. In his story, people were chained in a cave and could only see shadows projected on the wall. They saw the shadows and took them to be real, never questioning the nature of what they saw. Plato used this to argue that humans can be misled by appearances, and that we should try to escape the cave and seek out the truth. This original metaphor, however, was largely about poverty of knowledge, not necessarily about suppression of awareness. What the sources are talking about is more like a second prison within that first one. Suppose the prisoners did break free from their chains and walked up to the cave entrance. In that case, there would still be an invisible prison formed by the opening itself and the bright sunlight just outside. Sunlight representing truth, reality, or actual experience. As we move from darkness into light, our eyes would struggle to adjust, and the world would seem blindingly bright and painful to look at. What we could see would seem harsh and ugly, maybe even godless, and we'd be desperate to go back inside where it's dark and familiar. And this is what the invisible warden does. It keeps us stuck inside a much more sophisticated version of Plato's cave, but one that keeps us from seeing the world as it really is in a number of different ways. First, we're surrounded by what the sources call a wall of language. Language is a powerful tool that shapes how we perceive the world. Every language has its own words and phrases and structures, which shape how we think and categorize reality. Like Plato's prisoners, we've grown up inside the cave and taken the language we've been taught to use as the truth. But if we actually question what these words mean, or try to imagine what it would be like to think differently, we're often met with confusion and discomfort. But it gets worse. Above this wall of language is a second barrier, which the sources refer to as a conceptual framework, a set of underlying assumptions and beliefs that guide how we interpret the world. For example, many of us grew up believing in a Christian God, and that framework structured our view of reality. If we start questioning that framework, as with any prisoners who starts doubting the truth of their shadows, we're likely to encounter great emotional pain and distress. There are other barriers too. Beyond these two main ones, the sources describe a third as an emotional attachment to specific beliefs. These attachments act as glue that holds our frameworks together and makes them difficult to change, even when confronted with evidence to the contrary. And finally, above this lies the unknown unknowns, the parts of reality that lie completely outside of our current framework. These are not just things we don't know, but whole ways of thinking and perceiving the world that we're not even aware of. So long as we stay within the prison, everything seems normal and natural. We live our lives without ever noticing that we're confined. But what happens if someone breaks through the walls? According to the sources, it's a tremendously difficult and painful process, accompanied by intense emotional turmoil. Our brains aren't wired for it. We're not born curious about the world. We're born with an innate desire for efficiency. Our nervous systems evolved to save energy and reproduce successfully, not to seek out and discover the truth. When we're young, we're more open to different ways of seeing the world. But as we get older and form attachments to people, ideas, and groups, we become more entrenched in our ways of thinking. It becomes more difficult to consider alternatives. This is something the sources refer to as cognitive momentum. A lot of this comes down to motivation. We tend to see what we expect to see and interpret ambiguous information in a way that fits our existing frameworks. As we grow, we develop attachments to particular interpretations because they're part of our identity. Challenging those interpretations feels like challenging ourselves, and so we avoid doing it. This is what the sources call social convergence. Our need to belong and be accepted by others causes us to suppress our curiosity and conform to the views of those around us. At this point, you may be thinking that this sounds a bit extreme. How many people are truly kept prisoner by their ignorance? Well, according to the sources, more than we might like to admit. And there are two main reasons for this. The first is that our brains are designed to operate efficiently, not to seek the truth. We only perceive details that fit our frameworks. Everything else we filter out. This means that we often don't even see the evidence that we're confined. The second reason is that changing our beliefs feels dangerous and overwhelming. Our current frameworks may be limiting, but they're also familiar. The pain of giving them up is greater than the pain of staying where we are. This is what the sources call existential terror. As Nietzsche argued, we all wrestle with the need to keep our beliefs and the need to seek the truth. But what usually wins out is our desire for certainty. And so we remain trapped inside our mental prisons, convinced that we're seeing reality when we're really just looking at shadows. But why should we care? Why is this a problem? Well, for starters, the sources argue that it causes a lot of unnecessary suffering. When we're trapped in our own mental prisons, we're cut off from the beauty and complexity of the world. We don't see other people as they really are, and we don't see ourselves as we really are. Instead, we live in a world of our own making, a world that may be comfortable, but is ultimately meaningless. This is what the sources call alienation. It's the feeling that we're disconnected from ourselves, from each other, and from the world around us. Being confined to our own mental prisons also prevents us from working together to solve the world's problems. If we can't even agree on what those problems are, then we can't work together to fix them. This is why the sources believe that invisible confinement is such a pressing issue today. With so much of our lives lived online and in front of screens, we're more isolated and disconnected than ever before. Finally, the sources argue that invisible confinement stunts our growth as human beings. We don't evolve and change. We don't become wiser or more compassionate. We just get older. But how can we tell if we're confined? The sources say that there are a few clues that we can look out for. The first is our reaction to new information. If we feel angry, anxious, or threatened by new ideas, then it's a sign that our defenses are kicking in. The second clue is a lack of investigation. If we hold strong opinions about something but haven't investigated it ourselves, then we're likely relying on internalized frameworks. The third clue is homogeneity. If we only ever read or listen to people who agree with us, then we're in a perceptual echo chamber. The fourth clue is our ability to articulate other perspectives. If we can't explain the strongest arguments against our position, then it's a sign that we're only seeing caricatures. And finally, if our fundamental beliefs haven't changed much over the years, then it's a sign that we haven't evolved. Ultimately, the sources paint a bleak picture of our collective state. They argue that most of us are trapped inside our own mental prisons and don't even know it. And this isn't just a problem for us as individuals. It's a problem for society as a whole. It's why we can't solve the world's biggest problems. It's why we're so divided, and it's why we're so unhappy. If you want to learn more about invisible confinement and what we can do to break free from it, I encourage you to read the source material. It's challenging stuff, but it's also incredibly important. If we can find a way to break free from our mental prisons, we can see the world as it really is and work together to make it a better place. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.